With self-consciousness, then, we have therefore entered the native realm of truth. We have now to see how the shape of self-consciousness first makes its appearance. If we consider this new shape of knowing, the knowing of itself, in relation to that which preceded, that is, the knowing of an other, then we see that though this other has indeed vanished, its moments have at the same time no less been preserved. And the loss consists in this, that here they are present as they are in themselves. The mere being of what is merely meant, the singleness and the universality opposed to it of perception, as also the empty inner being of the understanding, these are no longer essences, but are moments of self-consciousness, that is, abstractions or distinctions which at the same time have no reality for consciousness itself, and are purely vanishing essences. Thus, it seems that only the principal moment itself has been lost, that is, the simple self-subsistent existence for consciousness. But in point of fact, self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception, and is essentially the return from otherness. As self-consciousness, it is movement, but since what it distinguishes from itself is only itself, as itself, the difference, as an otherness, is immediately superseded for it. The difference is not, and it, self-consciousness, is only the motionless tautology of I am I. But since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not self-consciousness. Hence, otherness is for it in the form of a being, or as a distinct moment. But there is also for consciousness the unity of itself with this difference as a second distinct moment. With that first moment, self-consciousness is in the form of consciousness, and the whole expanse of the sensuous world is preserved for it. But at the same time, only as connected with the second moment, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. And hence, the sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which, however, is only appearance, or a difference which, in itself, is no difference. The antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence only the truth, that is, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, that is, self-consciousness is desire in general. Consciousness, as self-consciousness, henceforth has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense certainty and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative. And the second, that is itself, which is the true essence and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. In this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which this antithesis is removed, and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for it. In section 167, we're going to get introduced to a new term now, a very important term, particularly for self-consciousness, but running throughout the rest of the phenomenology. Something that has been agitating behind the scenes the entire time, but which we haven't thematically formulated. And that term is desire, which you're going to notice I don't have on the chalkboard quite yet. That might actually provoke a little desire on your part to see desire there. There's a lot of jokes we could probably make, not at Hegel's expense, but using Hegel's terminology. But we want to see how desire actually develops. It develops naturally, he says, in this investigation into what self-consciousness is. As a matter of fact, he begins this paragraph by saying, with self-consciousness, we've entered the native realm of truth. So we're making a new progress into truth as something that is grasped systematically in relation to the subject. That's why self-consciousness is so important. Then he goes on and he says, we have now to see how the shape of self-consciousness, the Gestalt, right, a new form, a new shape of consciousness, precisely self-consciousness, how does it make its appearance on the scene? So its appearance on the scene is going to involve, as we're going to see more and more and more in the paragraphs that are going to follow, this not just concept but experience or reality of desire, of Begierde in German, which also can be translated as hunger, but desire works better than that. This is something that has captivated readers of Hegel since then. As a matter of fact, there's quite a few readers of Hegel who I think have perhaps given this too much importance, who have focused almost exclusively on that. There are certain people you could fault with that sort of reading, but it is quite important, so we want to see how it develops. And it's going to develop out of this reflection, or at least it's going to develop phenomenologically, out of this reflection on the relationship between the previous stages that we have encountered so far in the last three sections of consciousness, these three movements, right? And the new self-conscious self-consciousness, but not completely self-conscious yet, that is arriving on the scene as something not fundamentally new, but something that's been going on behind all of that we're now going to make explicit. So let's see how he frames this. Some of this we're going to see has to be changed as we go through it. He says, we want to consider this new shape of knowing, right? Knowing of itself. What does that mean? Knowing of itself. Well, as a matter of fact, for Hegel, you notice I've got this I am I thing here. This is going to be a cul-de-sac. We're going to get rid of this in just a minute. He's not lapsing into the, some people want to correlate Hegel with, Vedic philosophy or things like that, where there's kind of a philosophy of identity going on. Hegel doesn't deal with self-consciousness in that way. He's going to eliminate that. But what do we then have this in relation to? He says, in relation to that which preceded, that is, the knowing of an other. You notice I've got the other here in all caps. Why? Because in this section, this is going to take on some very important tenor, right? Some very important weight. A lot of what people focus on in Hegel tends to be the dialectic between self and other, where other is understood as an other self, right? Another human being, another self-consciousness. We're going to get to that. Don't worry. That's coming up very soon. But here, the other means the other of sensibility. So if it is another person, it's another person insofar as I perceive them, insofar as I cognize them under a concept. It's the external world, like I put here, the world of sensibility, the world that I can perceive, the world that is in part the world of experience, although experience is not totally subsumed by that. You could say that, in a way, Hegel is non-Kantian in that he doesn't think that, the realm of perception exhausts the realm of experience, that experience also happens in terms of the self, the self-consciousness, with an internality and a reflexivity that's involved. So, let's go on. He says, if we consider it in relation to that which preceded, the knowing of another, we see that though this other has indeed vanished, its moments have been preserved. So, we have the three previous sections. This is sense certainty, this is perception, this is force and the understanding. They have been preserved, they have been kept within the consciousness, which is going to be part of self-consciousness. And he says, the loss consists in this. Here they are present as they are in themselves. Now that sounds kind of interesting, doesn't it? The loss is precisely that they are in themselves, which means that they don't have what self-consciousness does. Whatever meaning, whatever sort of referentiality they have is really going to be coming from self-consciousness, and the consciousness that's giving them that is going to be part of self-consciousness. So they are preserved. These are things that happen. These are processes that we're going through. We're not just throwing, we're not just cutting out the first part of the book and saying, all right, we begin here with paragraph 165, throw out everything before that. No, we're going to keep that stuff, but we're going to reconsider our relationship to it. So he says, here we go. The loss consists in this: they are present as they are in themselves. The mere being of what is merely meant, so the mere being is the other in that case, and the meaning, the intending, the meinen, right, that we do by sort of, taking in the pure sensible before we bring language and concepts to it. That's the kind of knowing that's going on. Same thing with the perceiving of singleness or universality. We saw that dialectic play itself out in perception, or the thing in its qualities, right? The thing is a single thing, but it's also a universal thing. The qualities are single things, but also, okay, you remember all that, right? Force and the understanding, a little bit more going on there, a little bit more complex stuff. Hegel just talks about here empty inner being. Why does he talk about empty inner being when he could be talking about force or law or world? Because that's where we kept on ending up, right? Each time we would work out the dialectic and we try to figure out, well, what is the inner being of force? And then it turned out that that was the object, the other, for understanding. And so what is going on in all of this is that an other is being known, right? So for instance, if it's a book, I am knowing this book as something sensible. I bring it together under a sort of singleness or a universality. Book, this book. I might go into further, structures or something like that. Bookdom, all these sorts of things that we subsume under laws. In any case, this is something other than me. This is external to me. I am taking it in. The book exists for me. The book has an in itself being, but its being is also for me. I am not for the book, unless the book is reading me, a la Augustine, who says that about certain books, right? Now, Hegel goes on, and he says, all of these things are moments of self-consciousness. Before, they were moments of consciousness, right? It was consciousness that was understanding all this, but it was really self-consciousness because we were the ones following along with it, seeing that this is somehow supposed to apply to us. And now this is finally becoming explicit. These are, as he says, abstractions for self-consciousness. They are distinctions that aren't really distinctions. They are vanishing essences, to use another word that he likes, purely vanishing essences. So he says, thus it seems that only the principal moment itself has been lost, the simple, self-subsistent existence for consciousness, that which would have substantiality, what we've been looking for all this time, and what we're going to continue looking for as well. So he goes on and he says, in point of fact, self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception. This over here is the world of sense and perception. When we start thinking about it as a totality, right? When it's not just this book, but this book against this chalkboard as a set of objects together. This jacket and this tie, whatever we want along with it. Now, self-consciousness, this is going to sound rather Sartrean, but that's because Sartre is influenced by Hegel. Self-consciousness is kind of a whole in the world, in the homogeneity or the totality of what is. You have self-consciousness as a reflection out of that, or as a return from alterity, from otherness, from Anderssein, other being in this. So he says, in point of fact, self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception, is essentially the return from otherness, the return to itself from the otherness that as consciousness it is knowing, it is engaged with. It is returning to itself. So he goes on and he says, as self-consciousness, it is movement. It is some sort of process of developing or, of changing. And so how is this going to play itself out? He says, what distinguishes it from itself, what it distinguishes from itself is only itself as itself. So then the difference as an otherness is immediately superseded for it. Now, immediately superseded, remember, when there's immediacy, not so good in the Hegelian thing. That's a sort of hallmark that there's going to be more going on here. So immediately superseded for it. He says the difference is not, and self-consciousness becomes the motionless totality of I am I. So what we're talking about here is, how does self-consciousness know itself or relate itself to itself? it could do it in a, what he calls a tautological way. A tautology is where you're literally saying the same thing, you know. I am I, that's a great example. Bachelor is an unmarried male. You're just saying the same thing. 1 + 1 = 2, right? Now, this is tempting to fall into. But this is not really self-consciousness from a Hegelian perspective. It may be something that gets, recuperated as a moment of self-consciousness. Right now we're actually engaged in the process of superseding it or leaving it behind. But that can't be all that's going on. Self-consciousness, in order to be self-consciousness, must be an engagement not only with itself, but also with otherness, or as we like to say in philosophy, alterity, which is just another word for otherness, right? How is that going to happen then? This is where we're going to get to desire. So he goes on and he says, the tautology, I am I. Since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not self-consciousness. This is not self-consciousness because it doesn't have any substantiality. Why? Because it lacks any sort of content that it would need to get from self-consciousness or consciousness's engagement with a world. It's as if you can't have one side without having the other side. You can't have a world all by itself without there being consciousness to take in that world, a consciousness for whom that is a world. You also can't have self-consciousness as knowing itself without having consciousness of the world against which it can contrast itself, against which it can return or reflect itself, right? From which. So he says, otherness is for it in the form of a being or a distinct moment. But there's also, for consciousness, the unity of itself with its difference as a second distinct moment. This is very important. Self-consciousness, I've drawn it like this, right, where there's self-consciousness and consciousness, but really what we should be saying is consciousness itself is subsumed into self-consciousness. And self-consciousness as consciousness knows an other. The other stands over and against it. It presents it with something that is not consciousness or self-consciousness, but which consciousness can know, which it can engage with, right? That is what he's calling the first moment here. So he says, otherness is for it in the form of a being or a distinct moment. There's also for consciousness the unity of itself with this difference. So you might say it like this. The relation to the other of self-consciousness, right, is also part of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is aware, however dimly, of itself as grasping what is not it. So this is part of what makes conscious beings different from pieces of chalk. The piece of chalk engages externally with things. The piece of chalk is for me and is for you, and is in a number of different ways. We have the visual image of it, perception. We have a linguistic thing, piece of chalk. We have concepts. We have, even ways of understanding how the material world works through the understanding. We also have, beyond that, the meaning of the chalk for me and for you is something we can draw on the chalkboard with. By that time, we're over here in self-consciousness. We're no longer just concerned with sensibility, right? Or the concept of the thing. We give it meaning. We give it a kind of place in our collective or intersubjective self-consciousness. Very important. So when he's talking about these two moments, this is the first moment. This is the second moment. He goes on a little bit more and he says, here we go. With that first moment, self-consciousness is in the form of consciousness, right? We're conscious of the other. We're not thinking about ourselves in that first moment as that which is other to the other, or that for which the other is other. But then we have this second He says, in this first moment, self-consciousness is in the form of consciousness, the whole expanse of the sensuous world, right? So here we go. There is the first moment, this totality of the sensuous world that we take in. That is what we're constantly engaged with and experiencing and orienting ourselves in relation to. And yet, that's not where we stop. He says, there we go. The sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which, however, is only appearance, or a difference which in itself is no difference. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth, however, has for its essence only the truth. That is, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. So the meaning, the significance of the world, its substantiality, so to speak, as something for consciousness, lies within the scope of self-consciousness. It is part of its orbit, part of the way self-consciousness relates itself to itself. Not like this, not by turning into a monad, or some, well, you know, if it was a Leibnizian monad, the Leibnizian monad reflects out the whole universe, right? So that would work. But I mean some sort of compressed, all by itself solipsism. That's not Hegelian. This is Hegelian, right? So he goes on and he says, this unity must become essential to self-consciousness. What does that mean? That it has not yet become essential to self-consciousness. This unity is something that should be there, or will be there, but is not yet there. We might all, you know, if we want to jump ahead, say that we want it to be there, right? And why am I kind of smiling about this, we want it to be there? Because in the next couple lines, what's he going to talk about? Here we go. Desire. I know the board's getting a little messy. But you see the word, right? Desire. Begierde, he says, self-consciousness is desire in general. So consciousness, as self-consciousness, he says, has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense, certainty, and perception. But for self-consciousness, we realize that's not quite so important. Self-consciousness is really interested in itself. And it gets at things out there that it does desire, insofar as those bear upon itself. Desire is something that self-consciousness has for itself, for the world, for, in many respects, more than it can actually say. Because we're going to see that the entire, rest of self-certainty, or the self-consciousness, is going to be trying to figure out, what does desire really desire? So he says, the second object for self-consciousness is itself. The true essence, present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. So then he says, in this sphere, self-consciousness is the movement in which this antithesis, or this opposition, better put, is overcome. But the opposition is not yet overcome. That's why we still have desire at this point. When all oppositions have been overcome, then we won't actually have to talk about desire. But when is that actually going to happen? Around paragraph 808, right, at the very end. We're going to be driven, as following self-consciousness out, driven down the paths of desire that historical consciousnesses have themselves played out over the course of history. That's where we are going with all of this.